Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 471. All right, guys, welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise awareness of trauma and to support new trauma therapists just starting out on their trauma-informed journey. I do that through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. If you're a therapist of any kind, interested in learning about trauma, and you're looking for support and inspiration, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 by going to traumatherapist2.com. That's Trauma Therapist, the number 2.com. All right, let's get started. Several years ago when I was in graduate school and just starting seeing clients, I was doing a lot of commuting, like an hour and a half each way to my site. I was always thinking about my clients. What am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what the heck I'm doing. Why didn't I do that? Why I should have done that? And I always thought to myself, wouldn't it be awesome if I had a seasoned master trauma therapist sitting right there beside me in the passenger seat? Well, obviously that didn't happen. So I created the program, and it's Trauma Therapist 2.0. It's my online community specifically dedicated for new trauma workers. If that's you, if you're just starting out on this trauma-informed journey, you're passionate about this work, and you're looking to gain confidence, you're looking to share your journey, share your challenges, and share your wins, to get inspiration, also to help to inspire others, I want to invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 by going to traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist, the number 2.com. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Today, I am very excited to have as my guest, Alisa Zipursky. Alisa, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right. So Alisa is a storyteller, writer, facilitator, and childhood sexual abuse survivor. Her work focuses on offering emotional support to other young survivors healing from sexual trauma. She's a Moth Story Slam competition champ. She's been in publications such as Allure, Teen Vogue, Bust, Time, The Guardian, and Voices for Change. She's also been on Voices for Change 2.0 podcast. While based in Washington, D.C., she travels around the country giving talks and facilitating workshops to support other young survivors in their communities. Awesome. All right. So before we get started here, so you're in D.C. now. Where are you from originally?
From the DC suburbs. So,
Cool.
So this is home.
Okay. All right. So, well, let's dive in here. First of all, we're talking during this whole crazy COVID time. How are you, period? How are you doing? How are you handling it?
I am doing well. I live with my husband and my dog in a beautiful apartment in DC, and I have a lot of privilege and I'm able to be home and work from home. My husband's able to be home and work from home. So we're very privileged, very lucky right now, and we're doing okay.
Good. All right.
It's good to have, I might say also, it's good to have an excuse to, shower and wash my hair. So I appreciate that, you providing that today.
You're welcome. Keeping it clean here.
Yes.
Let me turn this light on here. So all right, so let's dive in here. How did you get to this point? I'm fascinated by it. I was reading your bio and I was thinking to myself, I just really enjoy talking to people like you who are how do you turn what you've gone through into what you're doing now? Anyway, that's what I was thinking. But anyway, Tell us your story.
So I'm 32 years old and live here in Washington, D.C. And I'm a childhood sexual abuse survivor. I was harmed by a parent. And like so many other CSA survivors, I really didn't experience my trauma until I was in my 20s, like really process it in a way that I could sort of cognitively understand. And I was 20 years old, and a parent, not the one who harmed me, died. And the grief of that loss was the first time I was diagnosed with post traumatic stress disorder. The trauma of that loss triggered the trauma of my childhood. And it was really in my 20s that I was first coming to understand that I had been sexually abused, because my memories didn't look like what I thought they would look like. It wasn't a narrative memory with a clear beginning, middle, and end. I was really processing non-narrative or body or somatic memories of what I had been through, and was really processing that in a nonlinear way throughout my 20s. And it was really when I was 27 and I was experiencing harassment at the job I was at, where all of these things just sort of crescendoed together. And I realized I just needed to sort of burn it all down to build it back up. And I decided that what would be most healing for me is to just be as honest and clear about what I'd been through and what I had endured. And I think I was just really tired of feeling alone and feeling the stigma of what I thought it meant to be in my 20s and to have been sexually abused by a parent. And I just was tired of feeling alone and just had this hunch like maybe there are other people out there that are grappling with the same questions that I am, that feel so isolated. And what would happen if I just sort of put it out there?
Mhm. So you said things started happening for you when you were 20. Does that mean that prior to that, you weren't aware of it?
Yeah, prior to that,
Okay.
I wasn't aware of it. I always had a really, you know, difficult relationship with my father who harmed me, and he wasn't in the house. It was somebody, it was I was with him on the weekends, and I went through periods of time, where I was sort of fighting back and resisting in my own ways, but I don't really, the number of memories I have from age 2 to probably 13, I can count on my fingers. I don't
Mm,
remember much of those years, and it's all sort of a blur to me. And I remember never feeling safe in my body,
mm.
and I remember feeling afraid and feeling deeply, deeply guilty. Like, yeah, like I was responsible for this person and their happiness, and that it was my job to sacrifice myself for that. Yeah.
Now, I mean, obviously, we're talking about delicate issues here, and
Yeah. Yeah.
you're not required. I just want to put this out there to talk about
Yeah.
anything you don't want to talk about. So I just want to set that
Yeah.
up. At the same time,
Mhm.
let me know if I can ask certain questions or not.
Totally.
But so was this over? Did this abuse happen over the period of years, or was this one
I
single?
don't know. I
Okay.
don't know. And Jennifer Freyd, who's an incredible psychologist and leader out of the University of Oregon and Stanford University, who's the founder of the Center for Institutional Courage, who's written about betrayal trauma, and Darbo, who wrote Betrayal Trauma, talks about, in her studies, she found that there was a correlation between the level of betrayal that a child was experiencing in their sexual abuse, and how little they remembered of what had happened. So, for as intense as the betrayal was, meaning like it was a parent or somebody that you relied on in the most fundamental and significant way, that it correlated with how much the child then adult remembered of what had happened.
Mhm.
And that is really aligned with my experience and the experience of so many people I hear from. I have been writing and speaking for 4 years now, and 3 years ago, it was March of 2017, I wrote this article called What It's Like to Remember What You Can't Remember. And it felt to me like I was writing this confession. Like, I just have to tell you all, you've been following me, we've been talking about all this stuff. And like sometimes I feel like a fraud because I don't have a clear memory of what happened. I
Mhm.
can't tell you from this year to this year and that year. And I know survivors who are harmed by a parent too who can, and I felt
Mhm.
like I just have to be honest with you all that this is, these are my body memories and this is my struggle to accept that.
Mhm.
And to this day, it remains the single most popular thing I've ever written. I would say 90% of my traffic to my website is people Googling, cannot remember what happened to me, or can
Wow.
I heal if I can't remember? And, right now in particular is such a triggering time for people. My website traffic is as high as it was when in the weeks after the Harvey Weinstein story broke on
Right.
healinghonestly.com. And I'm hearing from survivors every day in my inbox who are being triggered during this time right now by non-narrative memories, that they're experiencing a lot of them clearly for the first time.
Mhm.
So it's interesting that this part of my story that I felt like was this deep confession ended up being actually what hundreds of thousands of people really needed to hear and feel most connected to.
So and I want to have that article linked up. Obviously, we'll have your website linked up at the show notes
Sure.
page, but that article too. So you got to a point.
Mhm.
Talk to us about the point where you were like, okay, something
Mhm.
happened. I need to get help. What did that look like, and what kind of help did you seek out?
So I started in therapy when I was 20 years old when one of my parents was dying, and I went to therapy to help get support to be able to be present for the end of their life because I wanted to be there and I didn't know how. And that sort of grew into therapeutic support to deal with my childhood sexual abuse. I saw that therapist in the 2 months as when my parents was dying. And then when I was diagnosed with PTSD and really developing trauma from that experience, I stayed with that therapist. And I have been really incredibly blessed. And unfortunately, in this country, it is a privilege to be able to have access to a therapist and to have access to a therapist who is the right therapist for you. But I had the privilege of now I'm on my third therapist who is a woman of a certain age for whom therapy was a second career, who had like a lot of lived experience and decided to go into therapy and so have been practicing predominantly CBT. Cognitive behavioral therapy for 12 years. But when I was a child, I also saw a child therapist. I think I was around 11, 12 years old. I was in fifth grade. I know that. So, whatever age you are when you have kids, when's fifth grade? Whenever that is.
11. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I was close. So 11. And that was an incredibly, unlike the therapist I saw as an adult, that was an incredibly traumatic and harmful experience for me. And I remember very clearly telling the child psychologist that I didn't want anything my father to be hurt. I didn't want him to experience any
Mhm.
harm. I just wished he wasn't alive anymore so that I could be alive.
Mm.
And looking back, it's a pretty elegant solution for an 11-year-old who's going through what they're going through. And her response to me was, focus on something he's good at. Well, tell me something he's good at. I said, well, he's good at cooking. And she said, focus on that. And that was, her sort of sending me out her door. And,
Mhm.
I look back and I think that, in preparation of talking with you today, I was really reflecting on the powerful roles that therapists and counselors can play in our healing journeys. And that was a really formative experience for me. And I think kept me silent for many, many years.
Mm. So you start seeing this therapist. How do things unfold such that you're like, all right, I need to start
Mm.
getting out there, sharing what's going on with me?
Yeah, I think for me, um, I was really struggling. being a young person I was working in a nonprofit organization, a women's rights organization run by a male CEO who was harassing me. It wasn't sexual harassment. He said that I wasn't smiling enough at work, and that if I didn't disclose what was going on in my personal life, he'd take it as a sign that I wasn't serious about my job and demote me. And my job was to travel around internationally with him. That was my job. And I was going through my trauma and really struggling to manage the trauma I was experiencing in my personal life. Um, and the triggers I was experiencing in my personal life, and how work was sort of replicating that. And I think that that is what's true for so many survivors. It's not just about the trauma that we experience and survive and learn to heal from. It's that we also experience these second forms of trauma through our lives, whether it's through institutions that are harming us or other people in positions of power who are abusing that power, that then trigger our experiences all over again. And I really was going through that. And I just thought, I had I had so much financial privilege that I could walk away from that job, which is not true for most people. And I just thought I needed to change something. That surely there were other people in their 20s who wanted to honor what they had been through and what they had survived, and accept and talk about the fact that it was impacting every aspect of their lives, but also talk about what does it mean to be a young person dating and trying to have sex as a survivor, and what does it mean to try to hold down a job when bosses can be really awful and also abusive, and how do you deal with that? And I wanted to create a space where everything could just be complicated and alive, that two truths could be it had to be true at the same time, which was trauma impact every aspect of my life. And also, I was capable and worthy of a full and vibrant life, and like how to hold that together at once. And that's what really got me to share my story, made me want to share my story and put myself
Mhm.
out there and find other people. And the wildest part was that when I think about this 4 years ago, I thought, I was the only one. And it's not just overwhelming to hear from people across the world who tell you, I feel the same way you do. But to find out that I had been surrounded by childhood sexual abuse survivors my entire life and had no idea, and hearing from people who were very close to me and had no idea that we actually had this shared lived experience.
All right, folks, I want to thank my sponsor, Talkspace. We are living in an upside down world. We all know it, and if you've been waiting months to figure out what your future is going to look like, you're not alone. Between the uncertainty of waiting for answers, the stressors of school, of work. I mean, I'm suddenly find myself with two young kids at home, and that itself is a challenge. There's so much to balance. If anything helps reduce stress and anxiety, it's talking it out. We all know it. Talkspace has thousands of licensed therapists trained in over 40 specialties, including anxiety, depression, relationship issues, and more. If you have something you want to work on, if you have something you feel you want to reach out and talk to someone about, reach out to Talkspace. It's a fraction of the cost of in-person therapy, and you can send unlimited text messages, and you will be able to engage with your therapist at least 5 days a week. And that means never having to wait. Look, as a listener of the Trauma Therapist podcast, you get $100 off your first month on Talkspace. So go to Talkspace.com or download the app and make sure to use the code word trauma therapist to get $100 off your first month and show support for this podcast. Once again, go to Talkspace.com or download the app and make sure to use the code trauma therapist to get $100 off your first month. All right. That's very powerful. I mean, you speak with a lot of power and authority and
Thank you.
kind of groundedness. Was that always the case?
I think I was always a very opinionated, outspoken person. Um, it it was framed for me for a long time in my life as a weakness. That my inability to hold my tongue or put on a smile when I didn't feel like smiling. This that what you see is what you get. I used to be told I wear my heart on my sleeve or I'm too sensitive. And I think I internalized that for many years. And I thought I was too big and my emotions were too big and my needs were too big and that I needed to make myself smaller to fit in. And I think that's true for so many survivors, especially for those of us that, our trauma was a part of our childhood and how we grew
Hmm.
up, which is that we learn how to turn off parts of ourselves and how to silence really integral parts of ourselves and our personalities to be able to be smaller, to not, I think in our minds, to not create more problems, to keep the peace, to protect our families, um, over protecting ourselves. And so I think that those instincts are always there, but part of being public about my story was giving myself permission to
Hmm.
be that, as take up as much space as I wanted to take up, to let my emotions be as big as they are, to celebrate my sensitivity as a gift and not a curse. Um,
Mm.
that it
And
leads.
what are some of the challenges that come with kind of stepping out?
Mm,
Are
yeah,
there? I mean, I would imagine that there might be
yeah,
some fears or insecurities or what.
totally. I mean, I will say anything you think, for anybody considering it, anything you think that's going to come up is going to come up. Like your instincts are right. I'm really glad that you asked this question because I work a lot with college students and supporting survivors on campus. And something I heard so much this year across campuses is, an unintended consequence of this sort of iteration of Toronto Burke's Me Too movement, which is not at all, I think, what the leaders intended is that a lot of survivors feel a lot of pressure to be public and to put their names
Mm,
out there. Like, you know, um, when we exalt public survivors, myself included, by calling us courageous or heroic, it can have the unintended consequence of telling a survivor for whom that's not what's in their best interest for themselves, that somehow they're less courageous or they're less heroic.
mhm,
And, I want to be really clear, like when I came forward and I put my name out there, my full name, for me, that made me feel safer. And for other people, that exact same decision might,
mm,
maybe they've lived the exact same thing as me. And what's safer for them is not that. It made me, for me, it was aligned with my safety and my needs and my healing. And that's just
right.
so individual to each person. And so, anybody who's listening who's feeling like this pressure, I just want to tell you, just being a survivor and existing in the world takes tremendous courage. And that's like the end. That's period, full
That's a
stop.
really good point, and I think it's also useful for the therapists out there too, who could, I think one could very easily assume if you're working with someone that there's a lot of courage in sharing one story. But you're right that each person has their own journey. And I think
Totally.
you also hit it right on the head too, just living after having gone through. I can't imagine going through something like that. How does one, well, what I'm talking to you, how do you deal with that as a parent?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it's, I think that there are really incredible people. A friend of mine, Ignacio Rivera, they're the founder of the Heal Project. They're a childhood sexual abuse survivor who was also harmed by a family member. And they have this incredible, incredible, incredible YouTube series with their daughter called Pure Love Talks. And it's a talk show between Ignacio and their daughter, who's grown, whose daughter and their daughter now has a baby. So it's actually multi-generational. And they really talk about that. They talk about how difficult it is to parent as a survivor, and how parenting can be so triggering and can bring up so much trauma and fear for their child, and especially as their child becomes the age that they may have experienced that harm. And so, I myself am not a parent and don't have that experience, but Ignacio is an incredible leader that I look to, and I know is in the future as I hope to become a parent that they are like an invaluable resource because I know how triggering that can be for parents. My mother and I have been through a really long and important journey together, and she has become my greatest champion. And I say this both because I think it deserves an extraordinary amount of credit. It's not easy to watch your child put themselves out there. It's not easy to watch your child talk about their sex life publicly and all of that, as well. And I think that there's so much there's so much silencing that happens by so many people when it comes to harm that happens within the family. And I really credit her, but I also want to say, like, it was a really long journey for us to get there. And I think it's important to say that because for lots of people, they're deep in that struggle with their parents too. But I think it's really difficult for parents to support their child and to also acknowledge the limitations of their capacity to have protected their child from that harm.
Mm. Let me just remind everyone that I'm speaking with Alisa Zipursky, and her website is healinghonestly.com. So, all right, you've been doing this. I want to talk more about
Yeah,
what this is. You've been doing this
what
for
this is.
four years. So,
Mhm,
what's your goal? What are you
mm.
doing?
So for me, really what it is, it's about offering survivor to survivor emotional support. For me, as life gets more complicated, and as my work grows, I always go back to I just don't ever want anybody to feel as alone as I used to feel, and that really is just like what drives me forward in my work. It's always coming back to that sort of central tenet. And so I write on my website, healinghonestly.com, and I write blogs. I interview other survivors. I write a lot about my own lived experiences in a way that is infused with a bunch of humor, I'll say too, which, for me, feels organic and really important because healing's hilarious. But no, I think it's important that I'm a Jew. We find humor in our suffering. It's how we endure, and it's actually a really important part of my resiliency. But so I have the website, and I write for other publications such as Allure. I just published a piece of mine in Allure where I interviewed three really incredible child sex abuse survivor leaders on the work that they're doing. Um, but in addition to all of that, I also do a lot of public speaking and facilitation. And so I go around to college campuses giving talks about being a young person healing from sexual trauma, also talking about childhood sexual abuse, because on college campus, we focus a lot on the harm that's happening on campus. But
Mm.
actually, so many people are showing up to campus with harm that they've already experienced, and like me, are in their 20s and first dealing with their trauma. College is a
Mm.
really normal time to be processing childhood sexual abuse for the first time. And I also lead workshops, such as a healing and writing workshop. And so, writing for sexual trauma survivors to support themselves in their healing. So, lots of fun, different parts of it. But again, all of it is just to, again, come back to like never wanting anybody to feel as alone as I felt, and also not wanting anybody to feel as silenced by the stigma of CSA as I felt for so long.
Wow. I mean, I just admire what you're doing, and just think it's an invaluable resource. Again, you have like this amazing energy about you, and I don't mean this frantic energy, but a vibe about you. Um, w- Alisa, when you're working with these individuals, these what young kids, whatever, what do you is are there themes that come up when people are talking to you, and if so, what are they?
Definitely a lot of themes. So, as we talked about earlier, this theme, so I would say 90% of what my conversations with other survivors, the emails I receive, a lot of which start with, like, I've never told anybody this, not even my therapist, but have to do with people feeling invalidated in their own survivorship, like 90% of it. Then the rest is, I would say, like a lot about like sex and dating and like how to,
Mhm.
just like being fully alive and also dealing with this. But I would say 90% of it is feeling invalidated in our own survivorship. And it's what I focus a lot of my writing on. So whether it's we feel invalidated in our survivorship because we don't have clear memories of what happened to us, or we feel invalidated in our survivorship because All the other people in our lives are denying what happened. So we're
Mhm.
questioning our own realities. There are a lot of different ways, and it's sort of about living in a larger culture full of, rape culture, where survivors are receiving messages implicitly and explicitly all the time that there's some real survivor out there, but for X, Y, and Z reason, you're not it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so a lot of my work is just centered on debunking that myth that there's some real survivor out there that you're not for whatever reason.
Right.
Um, yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Helpful. And as we kind of wind down here, a lot of therapists of all kinds listen to this. What do they need to hear about this?
I think what therapists really need to hear, and what I hear again from so many people who are in therapy and afraid to talk to their therapists about this, is that a lot of people are attempting or trying to disclose in ways that might not be recognizable to a therapist. For myself, I was in therapy for a year before I told my therapist that I was having nightmares of my abuser sexually harming me,
Mm.
because I thought I was telling my therapist that I was like perverted. Um, and so, my therapist was great and she knew that that was something really important. But I think that, survivors talking about feeling unsafe in their bodies or having panic attacks thinking about being near someone, or they're having visions of something. I think it's really, CSA survivors, I don't really know any that are like come out to their therapist like, I know this thing happened to me. They're gonna, I would say most of the time, approach it very cautiously with, some sort of body memory that
Mhm.
they're experiencing, that they are, and they're afraid that it means that there's something wrong with them,
Mhm.
not that something wrong happened to them.
Wow.
And
Wow.
so that's just something that I would encourage any therapist to be mindful of. And just to remember also that remembering is not essential to healing, which you've talked so much about your show, which I'm so grateful for, and highlighted so many leaders in this movement about that. But that, harping on remembering, it's not just not helpful, it can actually sometimes be harmful. And lastly, that, I think that there's a really important role to play for therapists and for out survivors. A lot of therapists come to this work, I know you've talked to so many of them about, they come to this work because they have lived experiences that inform that, and that's wonderful. But I know that a lot of people in those positions are restricted on what they can say. And so I think there
Mhm.
is a really beautiful partnership between folks like myself who can be so open about their own personal experiences, as well as therapists who offer that professional guidance, to work in tandem. And it always really heartens me to hear therapists use my site as a resource for that reason, because I can say things that might not be appropriate for them to say, you
Right.
know?
Right.
So
Definitely.
that partnership is really special.
Wow. Well, there's obviously a lot to talk about. I mean, I'd love to have you back
I'd love to
again
be back.
and we can talk more. There's so many different avenues to go down. Alisa, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Definitely through my website, healinghonestly.com.
Okay. And in terms of any go-to book recommendations, what would you
Yeah.
say, whether, CSA related or not?
Totally. Definitely would recommend Aisha Shahida Simmons. She is an extraordinary leader in this
Okay.
movement.
Can you
She's a
spell that?
oh, sure. Oh, I have to write it down and make sure I spell it right. Aisha. A I'm sorry. AISHAH. Shahida SHADI. Oh my God. I'm now I'm like,
Well, email, you can email it to me.
yeah. SHADIA Simmons,
Okay.
SIMMONS. Sorry. The book is called Love with Accountability, and she's a
Okay.
childhood sexual abuse survivor. It's an anthology of all people from the Black diaspora writing about CSA interventions that don't involve the criminal justice system.
Awesome. Look, it's been awesome having you on here. I just really appreciate people like you who are getting the word out. I mean, this is what this is about. This is why I started this podcast, to help get the word out. And just psyched that there are people out like you doing it.
Thank you, and thank you for all your hard work. Your work means a great deal to me.
I appreciate it. Take care.
Bye bye.
All right. Thank you so much for checking out the podcast. I really appreciate it. And if you're a new trauma therapist, if you're a student, if you're passionate about learning about trauma, if you're just starting out on your trauma-informed journey, I want to invite you to check out my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. It's specifically dedicated to therapists of all kinds who are just starting out, who want to be around other people who are doing this work, who are passionate about learning and learning from seasoned professionals. Check out Trauma Therapist 2.0. That's Trauma Therapist, the number 2.com. Trauma Therapist, the number 2.com. All right. Have a great day.